like Ryan, Rayner, thank you guys for coaching me. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I live a poor life and suffer from hunger every single day. Because I buy into the idea that suffering is the path that I will live into the good life. I believe into the narrative that I will live a good life anyway because I've suffered in the past. There's no push on the opposition side of the house for me to change that suffering because I think that I would like live a good life at the end of the day, right? The issue on the opposition's narrative, that it forces people to believe in the narrative that as long as I suffer, I will live a good life because because there's no active incentive for people to actually change and address that suffering at the end of the day. It was only under OG side of the house that we change that suffering and we try our best to prevent that suffering. We tell you two things here. Number one, you make life more meaningful. Number two, you make life more happy because you don't have to go through all of the unnecessary suffering. All of these reasons so proud to be OG here. This is how we're structuring my PM speech, right? I'll be going to a few layers of characterization. I'll be going to like the main argument or what that result, like what that belief in self it believes it, like that result, like belief results in. Then second is on how that alternative that we are able to provide on our side of the house is able to solve this and why is it beneficial, right? First layer of characterization of why that belief is not entirely it's like not true at all, right? 3 reasons under this, right? Is how it is entirely possible for you to have a good life without suffering. Second thing is on how the state actions that can minimize suffering and provide adequate safety nets, right? Then thirdly is on how the state action that can regulate and to ensure adequate protections to be aid and rights to be help the people on the ground. So that means that belief itself is something that's not true because that suffering is something that's already can be prevented at a really like minimized extent, right? Second thing on what these sufferings are, right? I don't think that these sufferings are I don't think that these sufferings are just daily problems. They're probably sufferings that already have a direct impact into daily life, right? This suffering probably looks like working in bad conditions which like actively harms your towards like, your mental health, right? Or it probably looks like living in extreme poverty where you have to suffer going through extreme hunger every single day, right? These are issues where like you as an individual suffer in both mentally and physically, right? So you do have to know, right? Even if opposition tries to run on how it creates more personal growth, right? That personal growth comes from like learning from daily problems, but also comes from like trying your best to prevent all of those suffering because of narrative that you get exclusively under our side of the house, right? Because these are problems that you don't have to face through at the end of the day, right? What is the alternative on our side of the house? This looks like 3 things here, right? This is the belief of like suffering is not it's just like something that's not necessary at the end of the day, right? This probably we probably believe in the idea that you can live a good life even without suffering, right? Because I believe that in certain situations, a good life is not possible. It's like not possible even without suffering, right? But like what is this narrative so important, right? Because we tell you on how right now individuals do know that suffering is something that is not necessary. Individuals will focus their best on preventing this suffering because they know that suffering is something that is harmful, right? But then the way that you do this prevention in order for you not get through this suffering also creates personal growth in between because you try different ways to do so, and in the process you're also likely to learn, right? Fourth thing here answer is what that belief results in, right? There are 2 kinds of people within this suffering, right? It is how the people who can do something to change that suffering, and like this probably looks like working in bad conditions where you can just quit your job and go into other jobs, right? Or it's like number 2, people cannot do anything to change that suffering and will like not lead to a good life regardless, right? This probably looks like people who live in extreme poverty that cannot change the fact that they have like lived through extreme poverty and they will die as some guy who haven't made like $100, right? I think 2 layers under this, right? It is how people who are more likely to accept in existing conditions as necessary, right? Because the normalization of accepting suffering that is unnecessary, right? People now believe that it is fine to work in bad conditions because they believe that it is necessary for them to live in the good life, right? I think on their side of the house, it de-incentivizes people to change that suffering because they are bought because they already buy into the idea that, oh, I will live a good life because I've gone through this suffering, right? Then second is how it also normalizes the life of the people who have been through suffering, who have been through suffering is a good life, right? Because when I already buy into the idea, I probably perceive people who go through extreme poverty as somebody who's living a better life than me because they've gone through more suffering as me, right? I think this itself is something that's really harmful because it entirely overshadows the hardship that these people fundamentally have to go through, right? Because the people then become like less willingly to change for their own conditions and suffering, right? Because they think that suffering is like necessary for them to live a good life. Then number 2 is that people become less willingly to try to change the conditions that impose suffering onto others, right? Because of two reasons here. Is how they think that person's suffering is necessary for them to win a good life, so there is no incentive for them to do anything or to even care about it in the first place, right? Second thing as well, that is a problem because the moment in which you normalize it, people won't feel empathic or sympathetic to help these people, right? I think now on their side of the house, people are less likely to actually do change and like to actually help the people who live in extreme poverty because they think that it is something that's like it is living like basically living a good life, right? In conclusion, this like entire layer is that in situations that people can do better to change their own suffering or to the others that suffer, they are tricked into the belief by this belief by not changing anything at all or not even carrying it, right? Second layer here is for the people who will not have a good life regardless. This probably looks like poor people who die poor at the end of the day, right? Three layers under this, right? It is how we rather have them to not suffer even more, right? Because when people believe that there is hope at the end of the tunnel and get disappointed when they inevitably fail to reach a good life, right? Because on the other side of us, they trick this large extent of people into believing that I will live a good life, and then them dying not living a good life at the end of the day, right? If you're not if you're not going to have a good life because of what fate decides you to be in, Ops world forces people into thinking that because I had to suffer, I will live a good life. The people who suffer don't find a way to solve that suffering because there's no incentive or there's no pressure to push them, right? When we say that you can avoid this, like I think this is something that we our mechanism exclusively solves because when we tell these people that this is a suffering that is unnecessary and that is avoidable because people already know that something is something that's harmful. There is a push for people to actively seek change. There is an incentive for people to try to find life at the end of the day, right? What's the impact within our side of the house? There's like two things here. A, I think it makes life more meaningful because people now actively find ways to prevent it, right? So the people who cannot have good life regardless, right? I think it like enhances the way in which you live at the end of the day, right? Because you're actively trying to change that suffering, right? Second thing is how that happy life that you exclusively give to the people who cannot change their suffering at the end of the day, right? Because of two layers here. Is how people are now probably feel more sympathetic towards them because they know that this is something that is unnecessary. They probably like to opt for change, things like governmental change or give them assistance, right? But I think secondly is how these poor people will also like to work hard because they know that they want to change the suffering that's around them. With all of these reasons, we are the only side of the house that address the systematical issues we're so proud to propose.
Right. Thank you so much for that speech. I'd like to invite the leader of opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, beautiful. There is a glaring logical fallacy in the case of opening government. They say that because of this narrative that suffering is necessary for living a good life, people will not work whenever they're suffering because they think it is necessary and a good life will come whenever. This does not make sense. The point of this narrative is to grant these people a purpose when they are suffering because we're telling them that it is necessary. Just because suffering is necessary for a good life does not mean that a good life is the necessary outcome of suffering. We think those two things are distinct. Moreover, suffering is something that all human beings want to avoid. Absent of this narrative, there are external countervailing forces that prevail and are rife on opening government's world. This looks like the human psyche being risk averse and actually not wanting to experience pain. It looks like your family telling you, trying to minimize your suffering because each time you work overtime, you actually get a headache, and we don't think that that's very healthy for you. All of this suggests to us that inaction is going to be the likelihood that OG has to defend. But how do we construct this debate? 3 points. Firstly, how does this narrative play out? The framing here is that the degree of suffering varies. Government has to defend that this narrative prevents all forms of suffering in that you cannot say, oh, perhaps a little bit of suffering is necessary. They have to say that it is possible to live a good life without any form of suffering. We don't think that's possible. We only have to prove that suffering may vary from time to time, but it is necessary in every instance. It might look like, for example, your mom telling you to brace working for a 9-to-5 job. It might look like your father or your friend saying we'll go through this together when you're at a hard time or you're working paycheck to paycheck. Secondly, We think that the definition of a good life is not one of money or of being financially stable, given just how many celebrities commit suicide because of how unhappy they are. The reason for this is that a good life is defined by a sense of fulfillment or a strengthening in your mental psyche. This means that you're content with what you are, and in that sense, you are happier. Thirdly, we think that in any case where you want a good life, for you to have a strong mental psyche, suffering is necessary for you to be able to actually reach a good position where you can look at all your past achievements and all your life goals and say that this is what I did. The reason for this is that in a lot of capitalistic societies, we think that the game is zero sum, probably meaning someone is going to lose out. If that's the case, let's dismantle what OG gives you. They give you 2 points, right? Firstly on meaning, secondly on happiness. Firstly on meaning, they say that you perpetuate suffering, right? I think like people have like a natural sense of logic. Clearly, if you're not doing anything, inaction is just going to perpetuate this suffering. So that is why they're actually going to take action. Furthermore, this comparative is far worse because they find that whenever they're suffering, this means that this suffering is endless and it has no point, which is why they're going to be far more demotivated because they're going to start asking themselves, why am I even suffering? Probably not even going to work at all. Secondly, we think that suffering is a scalar quantity, right? There are different degrees of suffering. So it's untrue how you're going to normalize someone who suffered a life. Probably the more likely counterfactual is that you're going to find this person more noble because of the sheer amount of suffering that they've encountered. Then they bring us this argument on happiness. I just like to note, on our side, on the very least, we increase the likelihood of success because suffering is necessary. We brace these people to be able to embrace suffering like a banker working more hours, right? Government defense in action. And even if that's not the case, at least after you've gone through all this suffering with a good mental forte, with a good mental fort in mind, you're probably also going to be more happy when you're more mentally equipped. Given that, there are 2 points. Firstly, how we prompt individual action. Secondly, how we uplift minorities. How do we prompt individual action? The preface to this argument is that sure, there exist incentives in status quo besides suffering that get people to do action. But we think that suffering is a necessary driving force during times of distress, which is crucial because there are many ways people suffer. It might look like in a corporate ladder, how the workplace is very cutthroat and people might steal your credit when you've done this presentation. It might look like family arguments where you still have to deal with the stress of keeping a good image of your family. It might look like living paycheck to paycheck because not everyone lives in an ivory tower. At the very least, we give these people a sense of purpose when they're suffering. We direct their suffering, and that's important because people are naturally risk averse. But however, some things necessitate suffering. So what is like absent of this narrative, what's probably going to happen is that people in OG's world don't take actions that would lead to suffering because they don't think it's necessary. For example, if you're a morbidly obese person, you probably wouldn't go to the gym and experience all that suffering of lifting weights or going on a diet routine because you realize that I can still live a good life devoid of not suffering. Therefore, people aren't going to take the initiative in that world. We don't think that's a world we're willing to stand. Second, because this narrative translates into a sense of direction for people. Now, you understand that whenever they're suffering, they can think this is all for living a good life, right? It's something to do with the karmic balance, for example, on how all actions accumulate into the future. On government, suffering is seen as unnecessary, so they're not going to take steps that include suffering because they think they can live a good life without suffering. I just want you to think of that for a second because this means they'll never take an option that might be in the least harmful to them or in the least difficult because they understand that it's probably not going to do them good in the future. But this is bad. Why? Because the prerequisite for success will always be taking action. If you don't take action, or if you don't take actions that are hard, or you don't take actions that might be like full of risk, like for example, doing a risky presentation but might grant you the promotion, we don't think you'll ever reach a level of success where you can happily say, I succeeded in life. All of this suggests to us we get better individual action. I'll take a point from opening or closing. None. How do we uplift minorities? The preface to this argument is that some people suffer regardless. Crucially, these are minorities who are systematically oppressed. This might mean certain minority groups like LGBTQ who can't get jobs because of quotas, or people who lived in impoverished areas with high crime rate neighborhoods. It looks like the Black community who has to suffer in these neighborhoods where like crime is perpetuated and they're unable to escape from this poverty cycle. At the very least, we are able to endow the lives of these minorities and we are able to endow them meaning. The comparative is that on government, you are highly demotivated because you have no way for you to escape this cycle or this cage. as a minority, when we tell you that your suffering is necessary for a good life, you're more likely to strive more and be less afraid of suffering because you know there is purpose at the very end. And crucially, this means that all of your actions have a meaning, right? As a child, if you're suffering and you're hungry every day because you don't have enough money to afford food, at least your mom tells you at the very end, if you work hard, all this suffering is necessary for you to have a very good life and for you to be happy in the very end. Crucially, we would like to frame this suffering as temporary. So, in order to escape this suffering, we think that these people are more likely to be incentivized and motivated to work hard. This is important because these minorities are the most vulnerable groups of people and actively experience suffering regardless of what we do. So, at the very least, we help some of these people break out of this barrier and perhaps get into higher positions of power where they can act as icons to be able to have a trickle-down effect to help the rest of the community. I think then that all of this suggests to us suffering is necessary, and for those reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Right, thank you for the speech. I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Can I be seen? No, can't be seen. POIs verbally. Yeah. 3, 2. 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think the creation of the term middle class is simply a ploy to make people who have a degree think that they are somehow closer to people at the top than working class people at the bottom, even though numerically and financially, they are closer to being homeless than they are to cracking the top 10% in wealth. And we think that the belief that suffering is necessary to a good life makes this worse. OG tells you that the belief that suffering is necessary for a good life does not mean that a good life will come as a result of suffering. And to the extent that I think this makes some sense, right? But it does say that suffering is a prerequisite. And what it means is the same thing, right? That you need to suffer if you want to have a good life. And we don't think this is true, and we think also that it's harmful. The next thing they say is that people are naturally averse to suffering. And I think this is true, but I also think that the belief makes people less averse and less. I think the belief makes people less averse and less avoidant of suffering because they feel like the suffering has some meaning, the suffering serves some purpose. They are more likely to endure in that suffering in the false belief that, at the end of the day, I'm going to have something come out of it. The thing they say is that their good life is a sense of fulfillment and personal contentment. And to this extent, we agree. We think that a world in which you do not believe that suffering is necessary for a good life means that you are more able to check out from societal expectations of good life that trap you in the kinds of suffering that people endure in society, like having to go to work, having to work a dead-end job with zero prospects of promotion and a raise, kind of like what I'm doing right now, right? So I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about why the narrative allows corporations and governments to displace their own burdens and why you cause people to do less things regarding corporate and government actions that cause suffering. And lastly, I'm going to give a comparative as to whether or not people are more likely in our world or their world to take actions that help them lead better lives. So let's talk about corporations and government. I think the belief that suffering is necessary for a good life is a narrative and belief that is actively co-opted and pushed by corporations and government. Let's first talk about corporations and how they co-opt this, right? Firstly, they say it is okay if you suffer during your internship because you are still learning. This suffering serves a purpose. When you become permanent, you would have learned things, you will get better, you will suffer less once you become a permanent employee. Next, they tell you during your tenure as a permanent employee, you are told that it will get better once you reach management because then you'll have some actual powers, you will have a pay raise, you have promotion, everything. The list goes on, right? And the reason for this and why corporations do this is that by making your employees believe that suffering is necessary for their success, you are able to maximize cost efficiency. You are able to get them to be invested in a false sense of security in their future. You make them feel as if they will be, a part of your management in the future, right? And that means they are less likely to want to do things to improve their current situation now, even though they are not management, they are workers, right? So why does this lead to less changes in corporate decisions? Number one, we think that a belief that your suffering is essential means you're more likely to accept whatever conditions given to you by your employers because you believe in some kind of eventual success. You believe your suffering is necessary for your eventual success in the company. Meaning to say, number one, people don't change conditions when they can. They don't ask for a raise. They don't demand for promotion when they can and they should because, they feel like, I'm going to be part of the management and this suffering is necessary. B, people continue buying into the rat race, right? Increasing how invested they become in working society, taking loans to buy houses, taking loans to buy cars, taking increasing burdens that further trap them into this life of suffering that has no eventual end in sight realistically. And in this situation, right, we rather they check out and realize that, and in the situation where they can't really do anything about it, we rather they check out and embrace the Tangping movement, right? Where you just don't hustle, you do the bare minimum, and you expect the bare minimum. At least at the end of the day, if you don't get success, when you cannot get success, you don't get disappointed. Secondly, we think that a belief in an eventual success and climbing ranks means that workers are less likely to enter into collective bargaining decisions, industrial actions, or unionize, right? Because you see yourself as part of eventual management, even though your current status as a worker is diametrically opposed to management interests and the company's interests, right? B, you don't want to jeopardize future prospects when you get into management by joining unions, right? Well, what this means is that collectively there's less bargaining power, less leverage for you collectively to get better working conditions that will reduce suffering of yourself as a worker, right? And so these things is very much linked to that belief that suffering is necessary for success. And when you are able to get workers to believe that, then you are able to get this done. Similar co-opting is done by the state, right? People are told that austerity measures are necessary for eventual prosperity in the future. People then buy it and suffer worsening austerity, reduction in welfare, provided state services, reduction of state safety nets. And these will occur with a lot less objection and opposition with this belief. Comparatively, when people don't believe that suffering is necessary, people are more likely to offer opposition, right? They are more likely to care about other people's suffering and more likely to work to prevent it, leading to how you vote and what regulations you vote in. I'll take a POI from closing.
Nothing. You can take opening.
Opening?
Yeah, if you are suffering a 9 to 5, how do people in your world escape from this when becoming a successful entrepreneur necessitates multiple failed trials and immense stress, which they now want to avoid?
I mean, you can, number one, change how you view success. You can check out, you can don't take these burdens, you can reject these societal expectations. 3, do people take actions that help them to lead to good lives? O tells you that in the belief, people will want to strive, and in no belief, then people will just not try, right? I think people will strive regardless, right? Because just as there is an aversion to suffering, there is an attraction to success. People want to do success. I think the difference is people are more aware of what is reasonable forms of suffering, what is reasonable efforts that you can put in. They also more cognizant of what is realistic and they act accordingly. And this is where it's so important that Owen characterizes the kinds of people that suffer and the different kinds of actions that they can take. It's important that he characterizes there are people who can do something to change the suffering that they can and that leads to eventual success. That there are also people who just, whatever they do, they cannot change the fact that they're just not going to get a good life regardless. And the actions that they can take accordingly as important. Meaning to say, it is more likely that people can take changes when available to help themselves or others when it is available. But in the situations where it's unrealistic to expect that you will get a good life, it is unrealistic for you to expect that any efforts you put can be meaningful. We think it's better for them to quit when it's unrealistic. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. To conclude the opening half of the debate, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
All right. I will take POIs verbally. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Suffering is the means, not the end goal. The reason Gov loses is because they misconstrue the two together and interpret the opposition to fight for a world of suffering rather than one where we recognize what its true purpose actually is. I'm going to begin by making something very clear to you, Judge. The characterization of the narrative given to you from OG is extremely unnuanced and uncharitable. They seem to think just because we say suffering is necessary, we will never take steps to eradicate it and just kind of accept it as a constant in our lives. What was the nuance that Kayson gave to you in his setup? We recognize, as OG concedes, that humans are intrinsically averse to suffering. We accept that the end point of what we consider a good life probably involves one without suffering. But that also means that the concept of suffering that we defend in this narrative is seen not as the end goal, but as the means for you to get towards that point without suffering. What this means is that the concept of suffering we defend holds these two characteristics. Firstly, the concept of suffering that we defend is one that is short-term and temporary. One that tells you that if you act now, you can do better in the future. It is your parents telling you to study hard for now and to secure yourself a good education so that you're able to get a good job in the future so you don't have to suffer as much in a life of poverty down the line. This is why PLO's argument about corporation exploitation doesn't work, because we're still very much trying to fight against suffering. We're trying to fight against a future without suffering, and this also means that people who are unionizing, the people who are suffering now, choosing to embrace short-term setbacks in their current career for the sake of a future without corporate exploitation is the world that we're fighting for on the opening opposition. But secondly, we agree that this is not a guarantee, but we're phrasing suffering as a prerequisite. Obviously, there are people in the world who are not so fortunate, who are forced to suffer their whole lives. We believe that this is regrettable, but the fact remains that this debate requires us to be comparative. In the counterfactual on the Gov, where they just sat down, chose not to work hard, chose to put the bare minimum, chose not to fight for more welfare policy, those people would still die poor and in suffering on their side as well. The message that we send is that if you want to get an end goal of upliftment, the first step you must take is to suffer. The first step you must take is to fight. It is to put more effort than you believe is necessary, because this is something that will translate to fruits to bear down the line. The first question I want to answer in this speech: suffering intrinsic to existence? I'll take you later. This is a debate-changing question to answer, because the push from Gov bench to try to change suffering into something that doesn't exist sounds pretty good. But our question is whether or not it's possible for the Gov to even get to a point of zero suffering in our lives. If we manage to prove that this is impossible for you to survive, the entire premise of the OG case falls. OG loses this because 14 minutes into their case, I still have no idea what a good life actually looks like on the Gov. From what Owen says, it sounds like we're talking about societal upliftment and welfare. This cannot be suffering-free, because obviously, in order for you to get things like societal upliftment and welfare, you must constantly champion and try to get into a good job for you to have enough funds to lobby for a policy. You must constantly try to suffer through your job in order for you to be able to get a good career. You must suffer through your participation in your protests or joining societal activist groups so that you're able to get things, for example, like lobbying against corporations and such. From Wesley, it's the same. It's like we're talking about workers' rights and pay rises. Same thing, right? You are trying to face a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You don't just snap your fingers and sing kumbaya and all of a sudden all of these exploitations are going to disappear. What we told you is that suffering is intrinsic to life, regardless of whichever kind of civilization you are in. We live in a world where we have to work. We live in a world where we must put in a level of effort in order for us to be able to get money. And this translates into the end outcome of us being able to afford things like good food, or to sustain our families, or to achieve the good future that we have in the visions to the future. No matter what kind of civilization we're talking about, whether it be modern capitalism or back when we were cavemen, we had to also suffer and fight for survival, this is intrinsic to every part of our civilization and existence. The second question I want to answer: which side manages to get a good life? OG's mechanism for striving for change is, we don't think the suffering in our 9 to 5 is good, so we choose to instead to fight against corporations so that we can change this kind of suffering. I want you to ask yourself really quickly, which one is harder for you to do? Sit down and accept that your current paycheck is enough to get you just enough good food for your day, or to fight against an entire multi-billion-dollar corporation that is up against your single, like, blue-collar worker ass. The reasoning for why they'll never act is simple, because the path to social change is laden with suffering. suffering. OG, in the world where they don't believe in suffering, puts in the bare minimum amount of effort in every aspect of their lives. They cannot be convenient and say, we're good with suffering here, not quite good with suffering there. Sometimes we want to suffer, sometimes not really, so we're going to opt for the thing that I just better for my case. I think it's far easier for the vast majority of individuals to go with OG's logic, to choose to sit down, to choose to not work against these
Gelson.
populations, and to not face against these policies that actively exploit against them. We are the ones that opted into this because we told you, no matter how much suffering you go through in the current moment, the fact that you want to fight for a future with better pay, with better workers' rights, that is the thing you must suffer for right now. No matter how much they boycott you, no matter how much they actively cut your pay, you must fight against these corporations. That's how we achieve social change, not the OG. Our mechanism was simple. We told you this narrative is a necessary driving force to prompt individual action. Before I move on to explaining how exactly this works, I'll take a point from closing if there is one. No, OG.
So how many people in this world are realistically happy?
Sorry? Sorry, I didn't catch
How
it.
many people in this world are actually happy?
I don't know, bro. I mean, I'm pretty happy. I guess you are too. I'm hoping like
A better POI.
Okay. Better POI, sure.
So scale, right? In both worlds, people are attracted to success and averse to suffering. Do you accept that people under this belief are more likely to accept greater degrees of suffering and less likely to make changes when it's available to them?
I agree, which is why the path to change is the greater degree of suffering. You're fighting against multi-billion-dollar corporations. You're fighting against structural oppression. This is why the future that you want to unlock without suffering is impossible for you to unlock on the gov. We're saying, in the very least, the narrative is the counter-narrative to the human psyche's aversion to pain and suffering. We're saying you must now, despite your better instincts, despite your current ideas of wanting to be lazy and sit down, not do your homework, play video games alone in your room, you must go out. You must complete your work. And more importantly, you must join a social protest because we want to fight for better civilization down the line. Social action is where we get it on the opening opposition, because the prerequisite to every single action down the line is through the idea of suffering. Insofar as GovBench cannot prove their mechanism is devoid of suffering, they're destined to lose this debate. The final thing I want to talk about, what about the people who suffer? I want us to be realistic for a second. No one thinks a poor person deserves to be poor because we think that their suffering is necessary. There are plenty of other coexisting narratives like the concept of empathy. No matter which side of the debate we're on, we will always fight for the poor. We will always fight for minorities. But the thing that Kayson told you was important about how they self-reflect. When you told them your suffering is unnecessary, when you told them every single living effort that you spend your day off is going to amount to nothing because it doesn't contribute towards your future for a better life, doesn't contribute to your future upliftment. That was a world where you discouraged the poor from working hard. That was a world where you actively locked them out from a better future. Go with the O.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. To begin the closing half of the debate, I'd like to invite the member of government. Here.
Hello. Sorry. Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Perfect. I'll take POIs to chat at 5. As a famous debater once said, there is a spectre that haunts the landed gentry. And from CG, we say that the notion of suffering is one prescribed by the aristocrat that constantly haunts our conscience, and there is a need to change. I'll explain 3 things. First, why the belief that suffering is necessary for living a good life is principally illegitimate. Second, what opposition looks like. And 3, the changes that you likely get and becoming aware of these sufferings and why that is far better than the comparative in the status quo. First, the concept of suffering to succeed is a social construct that is illegitimate, prescribed to you. The reason for this principal illegitimacy is quite simple. The narrative that preaches suffering as a glorified road to success is often one that looks like, for instance, the American dream, where you work hard, you get success. Unfairness and exploitation is structural and stagnant on government side and across the bench. 1, we are all bound by the birth lottery that we are assigned to. Note here that most of us are assigned to a life that we do not like and do not prefer. This looks like me being ascribed an identity that I do not agree with. This also looks like me being born into a family that nothing gives me insufficient support to self-actualize. Two, the state and the upper strata of the society actively prevents you from climbing up to attain that good life. The reason for this is quite structural. One, the state needs to function on a hierarchy for which it requires people to stay in their own positions and classes to mutually cooperate to work. Two, the rich and the privileged are people who own most of the assets and wealth and are the ones who tend to gatekeep because humans are ultimately savage creatures. This piece alone takes OG out because for a government case to oppose to be true, there must first be a preceding legitimacy claim in principle for the government bench to have the principle to push for the opposition of this motion. We win on legitimacy over opening. The way in which the belief manifests as a form or as a harm is something CG will try to differentiate from. We say that the belief that suffering leads to success becomes a mass form of gaslighting and guilt tripping that constantly pushes you to doubt yourself. This looks like the glorification of productivity YouTubers that glorifies hard work by working 12 hours a day and sacrificing everything else in life to get the glorious outcome of the portrayed. This also looks like workplace cultures like lawyers being required to work 24/7 to make partners, as the PM mentioned. But I think this alone also questions the validity of OG solvency, because if you are jumping from one job to another, I'm unsure if the same harms ceases to exist. Therefore, the first harm of the status quo is that you continuously compare yourself up to the norm of manifestation of this belief, and therefore you become entrapped in this box of negative thoughts that you are not doing well enough when you have been working your ass off. You feel deflated, but you need to stay afloat, living in this constant desperation and hopelessness, because you ascribe the guilt of being mediocre to yourself. This is harmful because the society reinforces this belief infinitely in an echo chamber, and by scale extends to everyone else who is working. The impact of this belief is quite structural additionally. As O mentioned, a good life is not a guarantee. Note here, I think OO cannot make a claim per se on how success is ultimately achieved or that it's more likely to be achievable. The reason for this is quite simple. One, this is literally a contradiction within L's speech that success is not a guarantee. By logic, there will be people who eventually fail and wind up a failure. This means that the guilt-tripping effect snowballs because for people who do not achieve success, they become far more self-loathing and unworthy of success because of the echo chamber. Note, this argument functions independent of you succeeding in the end as well on a second layer, because on your process and your path to the eventuality of success, you are also by definition not successful yet, and so the journey is also one that is of a continuous suffering. The second preemptive insulation here is that marginal success is also rewarding to individuals that reach success in the end. The frame here is that for individuals that ascribe to the belief that success requires suffering, they also develop tendency for unreasonable and prospective expectations that does not match with the marginal success. The reason for this is quite simple. The way in which the effort is put into is often towards a multiple, towards quite a huge eventual goal. This is to say, for me to work 24/7 for weeks, months, or even years, I also have high expectations for myself because of the way in which society tells me to. I think this is quite important. No, thank you. In the sense that eventually, when we do get only marginal success, for instance, of becoming a paralegal after studying years in law school, it's also the point in which you realize that you have not done enough and that this is definitely not success by definition to you as an individual who worked your ass off. What does CG offer as a form of solvency then? The claim that we make here is also nuanced from opening. Opening solvency is to quit and resign from the suffering. We are unsure if this is ever completely doable because the frame here is that ultimately we all live in the same world. This means that for us to be able to sustain ourselves in the very own society, concessions have to be made and suffering is indeed somewhat inevitable, as O effectively pointed out. But more importantly, insofar as you're still in an individual subject to the structures of society, all your actions and outcomes are also therefore subject to the societal structures and institutions that dictate what you should do. OG essentially is debating in a circular argument of harm. They resign, they join, they suffer again, and suffering becomes never-ending because they keep quitting and joining again. CG is also not trying to argue infrastructural change, to run the Marxist extension. We understand this is quite a high burden to clear, so what CG calls for is baseline awareness and understanding of suffering and the source of suffering. I think this looks like taking things at ease when you feel as if you cannot catch up and when you feel as if you are struggling. The impact of being happy on OG is contingent on you quitting the structure, but CG gives you an impact that happens without you having to quit. What this means is that by blaming the structure, for instance, for causing your current suffering, is also the point in which you don't have to quit the structure because that's completely unfeasible to do, but more importantly, you find solace because you know that the fault is not within yourself. Even if you fail in the end, CG says it's fine because without the belief of self-gaslighting, you become far less subject to external pressure of being a failure by definition. Before that, sure.
So this benefit from you is very, very marginal. It is unclear how much emotional solace you're getting by saying, structure makes me a victim, but I'm still suffering anyway.
Okay, sure. I think the comparison is quite simple, right? 1% of people succeed in the world because it's often a competition of resources. Compare between 1% of people feeling happy as fuck versus 900, okay, my math is terrible, 99% of people feeling crappy because the society tells them that they are a failure. I think on weighing, we win by scale. Ultimately, the narrative of importance that CG preaches is not that we should quit because suffering is bad, but rather we say that it's unfair that we're being told by the state and others in the higher up to suffer. We say we find solace and peace at the point in which we stop blaming ourselves without the necessary quitting. Responding to OO, I also additionally argue that dying poor and failing to argue for structural change is fine, because ultimately the knowledge and the action to taking action to attempt to self-defense is the legitimacy justified in the instance that the state is the culprit that causes your current suffering. Suffer is wrong and gives us, the masters of our own fate, the right to take action, as LO mentioned. The contradiction they have is that succeed requires actions, but they refuse to take action to change the structure right now on government side. O's logical push is that success requires us to take action. I'm not contending this, but to everyone, one, success is selective and not applicable to everyone, but two, most people fail in the end because of the expectations they set for themselves and limits that restraints on their own, for instance, the birth lottery. Hence, as government, oppose.
Thank you so much for the fine speech. I'd like to invite the member of opposition. Thank you.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. What teams don't realize in this debate is that on both sides of the house, people suffer. On CO, we are the only side which gives these people a sense of purpose and make them feel better. I'm gonna do three things in my speech. One, I'm gonna do it with OG. Actually, I'll do it with CG first. Then I'll do it with OG. Then I'll tell you our extension and why is debate winning. One, let's do it with CG. By the way, I just want to point out CG is very derivative of OG. Like, sounding less China than Wesley is not particularly difficult and it's not an extension. Let's do it with principle illegitimacy. They say there is a social construct. And very funny, their example is there is unfairness and stagnation in the world. They say birth lottery. Yes, the point on CO is we would allow people to not be constrained by these factors and to push through them. Note, all the change, and this is the problem with Gov, every change that they want comes at a personal cost. It involves suffering. Martin Luther King, basically anyone who ever bettered their life empirically will tell you that they had to suffer and that hard work is important. So maybe it's true, but on CG you would whine about your birth lottery and you would not have any incentive to move past it. Number two, they say that, okay, we are not gonna talk about outcomes. We're just gonna talk about awareness. Again, I want to point out on the Gov, this is quite strange. If you say that people are suffering and should stand up for themselves, you need to first tell me what that standing up looks like. Like if you want to use the Bolseo argument, these people are poor, they are disenfranchised. OO already says that you cannot fight multi-billion-dollar corporations. The CO nuance is that you just shut up, maybe your life is bad, you sit there and you take it, but you find some happiness because something in the future, karma is gonna get to you, you know. We think we make people look at the long term. Let's do it with OG. Okay, Owen says you overwork yourself in a bad job, glorification, etc. blah blah blah. Member Gav says the same thing. Okay, but the comparative isn't that you suddenly go and get a better job. If you're poor and you're working as a cleaner, you don't have many transferable skills, you don't have any education or any riches to speak of, like what can you pivot into in life? The truth is, on CO, a lot of people are locked into their jobs. A lot of people hate their freaking job. Like Wesley, right? The point is we make them find some meaning and some purpose in it because they're always looking forward. On the Gov, they would be locked into their suffering. They'll be whine. They'll say life is hard. They would not like the suffering, but they have to do it anyway because they have no choice. They need the money. Number two, and this is a bit disingenuous from Gov. They say if we normalize suffering, we are not trying to help. We're not going to help the people who suffer. One, periods are normal and have been normalized. That doesn't mean we shun women as disgusting. In fact, we give them like period pads, free pads. There are talks about, periods being more normalized now. So I don't think normalizing something equals not helping them. On the comparative, CO's extension is brilliant. We say normalization equals more people speaking about it. Insofar as more people say, hey, I hate my job, I hate my boss, and your friend says the same thing, people are able to bond and form support groups. Note that on both sides, people go to 9 to 5 jobs and they hate it. On our side, maybe we get better internal catharsis because somebody else shares the same emotion as me. We are all part of a capitalistic system. The Gulf would suggest you overthrow the system by using Bolseov's argument in 2016 grand finals. We'd say you can't change the system, you have to live with it. This is a bit nuanced from OO. When people find it hard to move on from personal tragedies, you know, when people experience breakups, I think Ryan has a very good example, very personal example. We tell them that it's part of life, that everybody breaks up and everybody goes through this. People have to suffer to find the one. That's when people are more likely to move on. Thomas Edison failed 10,000 times before making a light bulb. I don't know if it's true, but you know, that's the quote. We give them the strength to get back up. Okay, let's move into extension. Our extension is basically why it's better for mental health. Before that, let's talk about why Gulf didn't want to give us a comparative. We think the comparative, if you don't centralize a narrative, is people being able to decide what suffering means to themselves. And OO is correct in pointing out people will not do the hard things which require suffering. The reason CO will provide is that people have a risk aversion bias. That is to say, people are very value the harms really highly over the potential benefits. This looks like people putting money into low risk investments like FDs, even though they are statistically making less money than the index fund. This looks like people wanting to buy a certified car from the dealer instead of a cheaper second-hand car. So people are likely to focus on the worst possible outcomes of suffering and not go through this. Extension time, brilliant. I'll take it in a bit, Wesley. Mental health. Let's talk about feelings of sadness, guilt, trauma, and pain. Look, if you work a 9 to 5, it's not the fact that you're working a 9 to 5 that makes you feel like shit. It's the way you feel about it. The way you feel when you go to work. Note this delta in this debate panel. On both sides, people who go to work 9 to 5, people overwork themselves and, you know, have really shitty lives. The debate is about the vast majority of people and how they feel. At the point in which we allow them to always look forward and defer their feelings towards there, people feel more motivated and they feel less suffering. People can coalesce and form support groups and shit on their boss. People can't do that when they're focused on individualized meanings of my life sucks, it's all about me, suffering is bad. People tend to bottle up sadness, guilt, trauma, and pain. We think we allow them to speak about it on our side. Yeah, I'll take Wesley.
So when you can do something about it and you eventually do something about it because you don't accept this suffering, isn't it a lot better for mental health compared to just accepting whatever suffering when
Correct.
you can do something about it?
But I think this is contingent on Gulf proving that somehow you can overturn the capitalist system. I think O does already say you can't overturn it. CO's nuance is that, you know, you rather just chill and be a normal guy and always look forward. Maybe you never make it. Maybe you're a poor person, you're a cleaner, but you feel better at the end of your life because you feel like you have some meaning, you had some purpose, and you know, it wasn't the best, but you enjoyed your life somewhat. On Gulf, you say the system is shit, but you can't change it. You're stuck in the same system which you hate. You feel worse every day. So the 1 in 99% argument MG makes, this is the scale, you guys lose. When we normalize speaking about it, the comparative Gulf has to deal with is people bottling up their suffering. That is to say, if we don't come out and say suffering is important to everyone, some people will feel like it's important, some people will feel like it's not. Most people will just bottle up their feelings and not talk about it because they seem like a pussy. The thing is, on op, we reduce the stigmatization and discrimination. People feel less alone when they say, hey, this guy hates the capitalist structure too. He hates his boss too. I can relate to that. I can relate to people who have gone through suffering. This is why we're broadly okay with things like TED Talks, allowing people role models to speak about their feelings, to see people in relatable positions. Even if you don't get any change, you feel better under outside of the house. On Gulf, people feel like shit. You can't change anything either way. CO says, let's lie with it and chill.
Right, thank you for that speech. To conclude the government bench case, I invite the government. Here, here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, give me a second. Okay. A world where people believe and perpetuate the narrative that suffering has a meaning, that suffering leads you to have happiness in the future, is a narrative that is encased in the social perceptions of what success means. I think this is true for a few reasons, including the fact that both opening and even like CEO basically accepted the frame, right? That is to say, people are influenced by social norms of what happiness should look like, and are like cognitively reinforced by your parents or your friends saying, aha, you must be rich, you must get this high position, you must like become the CEO of Apple and all of that stuff. What that means ultimately is that the way people conceptualize success and happiness is one that is very vanilla, because society tells them that the only worthy form of like happiness and success is one which is very materialistic, where you must be able to succeed in terms of work life, in terms of accessing power structures, etc. This is what both openings considered, by the way, and I think therefore this has to be the frame in this debate. What we say on our side is that irrespective of what people can or cannot access, the existence of this narrative itself forces people to view happiness via that very particular myopic lens, and the absence of this thing allows people to live their life without the conception that happiness is the only thing worth living for. Because honestly, a lot of people are not happy in the world. We think it's a lot better if people are able to accept their conditions and live for other things apart from material things. So OG and OO said two things that basically is a deadlock. One, they say they both sides get to people being happy. OO says, you work in the system and you plow and you want and you fight, and therefore you get happiness later because like you probably like get like promotions or whatever. OG says no, you should fight the system and change the structures that oppress you so that you can get happiness. Both sides can't prove that the majority of people in this world are able to access the actualization. So, because on OO, I do not understand why people why many people can just work and get success, given that upward mobility is by definition numerically limited. Like there's there's one boss for like I don't know like 10 employees or whatnot at best, right? But two, objectively speaking, most people are just poor individuals in the world. Like empirically, it's true that the top 1% owns half the world's wealth anyway. But three, things like racist and sexual discrimination, like birth lottery, the fact that if you're born in a poor country, they have no opportunities and all that stuff, still exist. So if you're born into these particular types of positions, it's unlikely that just pure work itself can lead to success. Basically, if you're someone who can access things like education because you're born as a broke person who's discriminated because of the color of your skin, I do not know why working 12 hours a day as a food delivery person in China leads to you becoming successful, given that you're earning barely minimum wage anyway. So I think the problem of OO here is that they prove that people gaslight themselves into thinking, I must suffer and accept the suffering now so I get success later. The problem is they don't get success later, and it's not for the broad majority of people who are not like, Bill Gates or like Obama, etc. On op, right, on Guff, right, because OG says, but you fight oppressive structures if you don't feel like suffering is something that you must accept, and therefore it's good. But the problem here is they didn't recognize why they actually achieve solvency of those oppressive structures. Like, yes, you fight more, but presumably the fighting is tiring. You'll probably hate having to like mobilize yourself. But B, you're still a poor oppressed person that's not in position of power, fighting against powerful structures like the states and majority people. So I don't know why the incentive to fight the OO proof is able to also show that they have the ability to get the change they want in fighting those power structures. So at the end of this whole thing, right, what I'm trying to say is that OO and OG both does not prove that people are able to access the type of material success and happiness that they both want to prove in terms of getting jobs, getting careers, getting position of power, etc., etc. This is where we enter the debate by saying we want individuals to accept mediocrity and not to have their life defined only as an achievement of material happiness, as opening said. This looks like, as Charles told you, the fact that I am peaceful is the fact that I am not like any great man in the world, the fact that I have solace in the fact that maybe I have like, I don't know, God on my side or a family or have friends, or the fact that I am like alive and have a somewhat okay job, even though it's not the best job, etc. But two, it looks like the fact that instead of defining success as only material, I look for alternate meanings to life. Perhaps I can be a stoic. Perhaps I can, I don't know, join Buddhism. Perhaps I can go dancing or like go debating every weekend, because that's how I find alternative meaning to my life, apart from trying to fight against like structures that locks me out of things that are material. We think this is the point at which we beat both opening at the end of the day. But the other thing the opening says, right, is the question of like whether people just like accept either accept suffering and do nothing against it on Gulf, or like basically like do nothing to fight their suffering on op, right? I think that at the end of the day, people are still going to be able to like do enough things to maintain their existence. This looks like the fact that even though I don't have a great job, I just do enough so that I could have a life that I can pay my rent and feed myself. I do enough so that I have a somewhat comfortable life, so that I'm not like like homeless, etc., etc. So they do enough to the degree to which they're able to access some levels of like like basic existence up, and not like care about anything else above that. And I think this means that it's the point at which like we think on both sides of the debate, it's not like people they will either be super, super, super poor or super, super, super rich. We think on our side of the debate, most people will still be, broadly speaking, the same. Will still probably access some small levels of material wealth and whatnot, but not great levels. But in comparison to the opening houses, we're going to be okay with that. Engaging CO. CO, right, basically said one new thing apart from what opening already said. People are able to form support groups and speak about it because somehow or other now because I accept suffering as a part of my life, I'm able to talk about it. One, I think it just logically makes no sense, right? Like the comparative is a narrative that says you are still suffering, yes. You just don't have to accept that suffering is important to your actualization. So in a world where I'm a janitor and I have another janitor, not now, all right, in my company, yeah, we can still talk about the fact that we are both kind of poor, kind of suffering, etc. Right? It's just that the delta is I don't accept the suffering as important to my actualization in the future. But two, there's a logical gap in the CO's case, right? Because they basically say, the existence of the narrative means that people talk about and are aware of their suffering. Without it, people will suffer in silence. I don't see how this makes sense. Because the narrative says you should accept that suffering in exchange for a future actualization. This means people say, tell you, right, that your suffering is meaningful, that you should accept it and you should move on and you should fight and like just, plow more time into work or whatever. I don't think this allows individuals who want to bitch about the suffering, like, to bitch about it, right? Because basically when they say, oh my God, I'm suffering so much, the response is, yeah, so what? So I'm also suffering, just fuck off. We all work, we all like, just kind of work in the system and it's going to be useful for your future anyway. So why are you complaining about it? So I think, right, the world in which people no longer accept that suffering is something that is going to give them material benefits is the world at which people say, okay, I am suffering, so are you. And that's the point at which the like gaslighting of people telling you that it is for a purpose that you probably won't access anyway, that you should not bitch about the fact that you have the ability to access happiness in the future goes away. That is when support groups are better, because that is when people don't gaslight each other, but help each other in recognizing that each other's suffering does not lead to good things and that they should like strive for more meaningful things in their life.
All right, thank you for that speech. To conclude the debate, I'd like to invite the opposition with Kayson.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Before we begin, I want to make a few shout outs. First to Ryan Wong for inviting me to this tournament and getting my mind off East Malaysia Open. It's really cool that I got to meet this guy at SSIDC. Really cool guy. Yeah, there are a lot of Ryans in the circuit, so it's nice that I got the best one. Thank you to the Caps, Eunsi and Andra, and also Ankit Shah. Really good motions. To my friends, Wesley, Kavi, Chris, even Owen, like legit, all my kids watching this, insane lah. You guys are amazing debaters, and thank you all for coming and supporting me. All right, starting speech in 3, 2, 1. When me and my ex broke up on March 31st, I was fucking depressed. It was a toxic spiral because I kept trying to convince myself I was happy, but I clearly wasn't. Because me and my fucking ego could not see past the suffering because by the breakup, that I'm not suffering crippling loneliness because of her. It was only when I acknowledged my suffering that suffering is a crucial part of good mental states, is part of a good process of healing, that only when can I say I truly got over her. Don't misconstrue our case and call us derivative. We are not saying that when you feel suffering, you get material benefits in the future like OO was saying. We are saying that feeling the emotions like anger and grief and acknowledging it is okay. So everything CG tries to throw at us is wrong because the current status quo suggests that suffering is good so you can feel happiness in the future. The CO case is to suggest that suffering in and of itself is a good thing to feel and acknowledging is a good thing. 2 questions I want to answer. Sorry, 3. 1, why do we outweigh our opening? 2, what do we bring in CO? And 3rd, how does it beat the Gulf bench? Question number 1, why do we outweigh our opening?
I want to note the opening, which is to explain that when you frame the suffering people face, like working overtime as a bank as an underprivileged black man, as something important because it gives you satisfaction. That suffering is good because you can use this as motivation to get rewards, like going to the gym if you're a fat person. I want to note that this is insufficient and problematic for two critical reasons. The first, the kinds of suffering OO talks about is that this suffering is good, not because it's the emotions you feel, but because this is good, so you can get a better life in the future. But bro, this is a this house opposes / this house supports motion. You need to defend the concept of suffering because it is necessary in all instances when it comes to getting a good life. B, even if you feel angry, putting it into working hard or using your grief as motivation is bad. You are likely to lead into burnout. You're going to be irrational and not take care of yourself. A very common example is why a lot of fat people growing up develop a lot of eating disorders, because they channel all their negative emotions into losing weight, which creates a lot of physical harm for these individuals. Because instead of processing through the bullying that they face through high school for being a fat kid, they instead use that anger and take it out on themselves via doing things like losing weight at incredibly fast rate or developing anorexia or bulimia as a form of self-harm, which ultimately leads to worse mental states. But furthermore, this particular impact is also incredibly uncertain because even if you work incredibly hard, it's unclear to me how much you can climb up within the social ladder, as OG explains. Question number 2. This is what the CO provides. 2 things. The first is that feelings of suffering you get is okay, which takes a higher burden than the OO. Some people cannot help but view their breakup as suffering. Some people cannot help but view working in a capitalistic society as suffering, working fucking 20 hours a day. But because of them getting racially discriminated against in your workplace is obviously a shitty thing. What changes on our side is people acknowledging the emotional suffering that they feel and not gaslighting themselves like what happens in the counterfactual on both OG and OO. Second, we also explain that you don't have to use that grief and channel it into something else, something productive. We change the narrative on CO that you don't have to create something out of your own grief and suffering. That it's okay to just feel sad and angry, right? Like I don't have to go on Tinder to swipe on so many girls, right? Like, it is okay for me to feel sad that I'm not with my ex anymore because of the fact that it is okay for me to feel sad and angry, that I am a complex human being with many emotions. We think when you enforce this narrative, it tells people that it's okay for them to feel these kinds of emotions as opposed to getting gaslighted.
Point.
Why does this lead to the impact of a better life? You acknowledge your grief and suffering. The current status quo is gaslighting yourself into feeling happy. There's a stigmatization that if you only need to go for therapy if you're depressed, and you're crazy if you feel depressed, and that you're mentally ill. Wesley's POI is that it's just better to not dwell. The problem is that people feel depressed, but they will still say, I don't need therapy because I'm not depressed. I'm happy. This is precisely what stops people from entering into therapy or even taking the steps to process and heal. Like, to quote my therapist, Ryan, stop self-rationalizing your emotions and trying to outsmart your emotions. That it's okay to just feel sadness and anger. You don't have to put it into something productive because it's uncertain. If you're not clear in your head or if you're not clear in your mind, you're unlikely to produce anything good anyways. But on our side of the house, you get mentally healthier people, and that's good because just feeling sadness and just feeling anger is a perfectly fine emotion to feel. Why is this important? It is
Yeah,
A to all their argumentation. No, thank you. Because if they want to run that people will feel happy in the future when they suffer now physically, we beat this. Like, the intuition pump for this is simple, right? If you're fat now, you're going to hate yourself and you're going to use that as motivation to lose weight. And you do it dangerously, like developing eating disorders under the guise of, oh, I'm happy because I'm losing weight. When in reality, the only reason why you're happy is because you don't hate. The only reason why you're happy is because you hate yourself a little bit less. Because now you're losing a lot of that weight. Because you're like fueling the
Opening?
toxic self-hatred that you have in your body. We think that on our side, when you acknowledge your anger and process it, only then you can get healthier forms of emotions. Like working hard, acknowledging that you need to take breaks, that it is okay for you to take a mental health day from not going to work so you can feel much happier. But before I move on, I'll take from CG. 1, 2, 3, opening.
Yeah.
So
You are making
we have
our
shown
case.
that-
Okay, I'm just
open your
moving on
closure.
because you guys cannot decide. All right, question 3. How does it beat the Gov bench? Look, CG is derivative. They literally start off their speech by explaining that the American dream, what the American dream is, and then slap the word principle on it. So I'll just take them out both here.
Last
2
chance.
reasons. The first is that if their material is on exploitation and rising against it, note that this is a wash in the opening exchange. No one here knows for certain if they can dismantle capitalism. Even CG acknowledges this. Government says you can overthrow capitalism. OO says you can climb up the social ladder. I'm going to break this deadlock because even if you cannot dismantle capitalism or climb up the social ladder, it's certain that everyone will feel emotions like sadness, anger, and grief and will suffer these emotions afterward. What is certain on CO is that you allow people to acknowledge these feelings instead of bottling them up and further spiraling into toxic behaviors. Second, in terms of the long term, even if you dismantle OO's case, like if you look at OO's case, it's contingent on people being able to make something meaningful from that suffering. That they even concede that this is also uncertain. Our case, however, isn't. Look, you don't have to make something out of your sadness. Like, this is fucking terrible. Because if you don't, people will feel even worse. Even if your parents force you to study 20 hours a day and you're expected to be a valedictorian, what happens after, right? You will still feel sad regardless. So in the long-term scale, we're not contingent on material successes. We're contingent on emotional, self-retrospective behaviors where individuals can feel happiness irregardless of what happens around them because they acknowledge those certain emotions. For all those reasons, Inside Out 2 is the best movie I've ever watched this year. OG. Sorry, I mean CO.
All right. Thank you so much everyone for the wonderful debate. I invite all teams to virtually cross. I'd like to invite all the